Hello everyone, I'm Jennifer Mers and I'm delighted to be here. I'm a writer and illustrator of picture books and I'm excited to show you my newest book, Steadfast, Frances Perkins, Champion of Workers' Rights. I discovered Frances while doing my MFA degree in illustration at the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York. It was 2011 and FIT, with its long connection to textiles, was commemorating the 100th anniversary of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, a tragedy that Frances witnessed. I created handcrafted collages for that anniversary, works that spoke to the 1911 narrative and that incorporated the fabrics and trimmings of my own textile background. But as I worked and as I researched, who did I find? Who found me? But Frances. She was everywhere. Workers' rights, women's rights, safety issues, government politics, immigration, and of course, the New Deal and Social Security. Why had I never heard about this woman? Why had so many not heard about this remarkable woman? It became evident that I needed to create a picture book on this American hero and role model. I needed to get the word out to the children. Children, girls in particular, need to know the empowering, inspiring story that is Frances Perkins. I researched, I read, I wrote, I sketched, and I cut buckets and buckets of collage papers. I met Tomlin and Sarah. I watched Summoned, and I read Downey. And voila! Steadfast will be released this September. Signed copies will be available at my website, jennifermers.com, and at the Frances Perkins Center. My art prints and cards will also be available soon, both at the center and on my website, jennifermers.com. Nice to see you.
Hello, I'm Tom Levitt and I'm the author of The Courage to Meddle, a new book about Frances Perkins. I first came across Frances when I was visiting the Tenement Museum in New York in about 2013. I toured the city and looked at it in a new light after that and visited the site of the Triangle Factory fire in Washington Square, where Frances herself would have stood. I read about the tragedy in this book, and that led me to a lifetime of investigation into her. Well, I say a lifetime, a few years certainly, culminating in reading not only, of course, the classics, Kirsten's book and George Martin's book, but to spend 3 weeks in the summer of 2019 touring the New York State and the northeast of the United States. I visited Mount Holyoke College. I visited Worcester, Cornell University, Albany, where I spent time in the archives, and other places which were important parts of Frances's life. Of course, I also came to Damariscotta and Newcastle and met the great team there. I sincerely believe that Frances Perkins was the most important woman in politics anywhere in the world in the first half of the 20th century. And I look in this book at not only the standard episodes of her life, but also how she was involved in the campaign against racism, the campaign to support Jewish refugees in the 1930s, and to look at how the policies she brought in the 1930s have impacted upon Britain and America and the whole world today. I really enjoyed writing the book, and I hope you'll enjoy reading it too.
On the book, I'm, as the author, Ruth Cashin Monsell, but my friends call me Rue. I wrote a biography about Frances Perkins, who I thought of as a superhero, but the eventual title came to be Frances Perkins, Champion of American Workers. And she was all that and much more. Well, I have always been a feminist. I think my mother raised me to be one before it was fashionable and before I knew the word. And it shocked me when I first came to this house, Frances Perkins Homestead, how very much she contributed to America and to major changes for the better in our country at a time of desperately dire circumstances, the Great Depression. For one thing, Frances was so far ahead of her time by virtue of her gender. And I think there was a great deal, I know that there was a great deal of opposition to a woman for the first time in many of the positions she held. She brought about major changes in America, and people on, as today we say, the other side of the aisle didn't always like that. But I think we will never know exactly why she was so left out of the history books, but I think many women were. It's designed for precocious young people, as young as perhaps 6th grade, who are good readers, but I made every effort not to make it simplistic or to talk down to the reader so that it should engage high school students, and I've been told by the adults who've read it that it engaged them very much too. So that's my hope, that the book will go far and people will love it.
Hi, I'm Sarah Peskin. Welcome to our 12th annual garden party at the Frances Perkins Center. This year, circumstances caused us to reimagine this event that is normally held at the place that Frances Perkins loved so much, now the Frances Perkins Homestead National Historic Landmark. Previously, we had a chance to catch up with old friends, make new ones, and listen to some wonderful speakers. This year, we welcome friends from Tasmania to Tel Aviv and greet new friends virtually. And we still get to listen to a wonderful presentation about Frances Perkins, whose legacy we honor. It's no accident that we meet at this time of the year to recognize the signing of the Social Security Act on August 14, 1935, the foundation of our basic American social safety net and Frances Perkins's most important contribution to the economic well-being of the American people. And even though this is a virtual gathering, we will have cake. An advantage of this kind of gathering is that it lets us drop in on quiet conversations of our friends who are so helpful to the center. And I'm delighted to say that we have many friends for you to meet tonight. First is Tomlin Perkins Coggeshall, Frances Perkins' grandson, and the impetus behind preserving this historic homestead. Our executive director, Michael Cheney, sat down with Tomlin to discuss the preservation of the brick house.
As we all know, this has been a very important milestone for the year for the center and for you and Christopher as well. Can you tell us about your decision and how you came to embrace it, looking to the future?
Well, it gradually evolved after my mother died in 2003. It became clear that we were chickadees on an ostrich egg here in terms of properly taking care of this beautiful place and in terms of keeping it in good shape and being able to live a life ourselves. And I thought, before just selling the house to the open market, maybe there's some center of gravity or critical mass that could be achieved here for an organization that would be about my grandmother, preserving her legacy and carrying on her work.
Well, we all thank you for your generosity and inspiration that enabled the new organization to purchase the property in 2020 and move on to the next stage in the life here at the Frances Perkins Homestead.
Wonderful. Well, it's been a joy, and it still is, to be part of this place and to have the organization come through and go ahead and purchase has been wonderful for me and Christopher. But we're also mainly, I'm just so happy that the organization, an organization that I trust to take good care of the place and to carry on the work, has acquired it, and it's just a dream that came true. This property meant so much to my grandmother. She would come here during her busy career from Washington just to get away for a couple of weeks in the summer and have time to renew and rejuvenate and have energy to go back to continue her work in a pretty hectic world, where she had to fight quite hard for a number of the improvements that she was able to make. It was a real place of her in her heart. Her heart lived here. I think she thought of it as the family seat. It had been a wedding present for her grandmother in 1837. This house, the brick house, and she just loved coming here to be with her grandmother over the years as she grew up. She gathered many pearls of wisdom from her grandmother, including, "If a door is open for you, my dear, you must walk through and do your best on the other side." So she built her character here, and also in her early years, and then in her later years, she renewed and strengthened her character here. So it was an important place for her.
Once Tomlin realized how important it was to preserve the family homestead, he set about creating the perfect team to create this miracle. In retrospect, we call this group the Founders. Christopher Bryseth joined soon after and became an early chair of the board. He offers a glimpse into the remainder of the team.
Two of the key people in working through all this was Leah Sprague, who, as a lawyer, really was concerned about how this structure was going to work and how we were going to meet all the demands of a 501c3. And Sarah, who was a National Park Service career employee and had worked a lot with historic sites.
Well, I was invited to dinner one night here. Probably it was around '08. Because what I remember, and Gretel Porter was there, and Christopher and Tomlin. And they were laying out the idea of this place as a center to honor his grandmother.
Gretel Porter had a sense of Susanna Perkins, Coggeshall, and I think had a sense of the house. She'd actually worked with the library and the house, so preserving the facility with all of its character was very important to her. I think Betty Allen, who is a very pragmatic, sophisticated organizational person, knew the kind of things that we would have to pull off if we were going to be a successful organization.
I don't know anything about old houses and, a more historic context for fundraising. I mean, it wasn't the kind of fundraising I had ever done. So I was trying to be helpful and think about who else they should talk to. And I mentioned Sarah and helped get her involved with the center. So I consider that probably the biggest impact I had, getting Sarah involved.
They each had a different sense of Frances Perkins. And in talking about how this organization should evolve, they each kind of pushed for their view. Susan Feiner, a wonderful social scientist at the University of Southern Maine, who had a strong sense of the progressive tradition and a left-leaning liberalism, wanted to make sure we captured that side.
Tomlin was saying he wanted to somehow honor his grandmother. And I didn't even ask any other questions. I said, I'm in. What can I do to help? I set up the internship program between Mount Holyoke College, my alma mater, and Frances Perkins' alma mater, and the Frances Perkins Center, because I'm passionate about education. And I wanted to make sure that her legacy lived for a long, long time. The more people you educate, the more people you give an opportunity to, you open a door to, then you can, those people go on to do amazing things. And they're just the inspiration of learning more about this particular woman, Frances Perkins, the New Deal, what she did for our country that continues to benefit almost every single one of us every day, particularly now in the middle of a pandemic, is just absolutely remarkable.
I've got degrees in public policy planning. I certainly knew she was the first female, cabinet member, but I didn't get it. It wasn't until Leah organized an event at the Newcastle Historic Society where she brought in Kirsten Downey to give the talk on her bio of Frances. And all of a sudden it was like, oh my God, all the stuff she did. And that's when I realized it. And she didn't get her due.
I had the pleasure of knowing her. She was teaching at Cornell in the Industrial Labor Relations School, and I had the idea to ask her down for dinner to give a talk. And she did, and I remember asking her after dinner to start the conversation, Ms. Perkins, what do you regard as your most important accomplishment? And she said, Social Security. And we went on from there. Then we asked her, we met as a committee. I said, why didn't we ask her to come and live with us? We had other faculty members living with us, short term, but we had also one long term, Professor George Sabin. I was the one that asked her to live with us. I said, now you need to understand, Ms. Perkins, we're very messy, we're very noisy. Your room would be right over the music room, and there's Bach, Brubaker, and Bartók going on at all hours. So we won't change because you're here. When she left that night with Morris Neufeld and his wife, who had worked this out with me beforehand, he was her boss, the ILR school. She said, Morris, do you know what those boys have done? And he said, yes, Miss Perkins. She said, I feel like a bride on her wedding night.
Alice Kessler Harris is a towering figure in the fields of women's history and labor history. Over the course of her long and influential career, Kessler Harris has published numerous articles and books that explore the interplay of gender, class, and social policy. The strongest example of this was her book, In Pursuit of Equity: Women, Men, and the Quest for Economic Citizenship in 20th Century America. Professor Emerita of American History at Columbia University, she's made a significant impact on public history as well. With the New York Historical Society, her first book, Women Have Always Worked, became the basis of a massive open online course, a MOOC, now available via edX. She's a generous mentor and a leader in the historical profession. She's taught at Rutgers and Columbia and encouraged the greater inclusion of women within the historical profession. She found a new publisher for the fiction of Anzia Yezierska, a much-acclaimed Eastern European Jewish immigrant writer, now a staple of courses for literature and English language learners. Especially interesting considering Kessler Harris's own immigrant history and someone for whom English was her third language. We're honored that she's accepted the 2020 Frances Perkins Center Intelligence and Courage Award and agreed to share with us her insights today. Ladies and gentlemen, Alice Kessler Harris.
Thank you, Sarah, for that very generous introduction. I'm really happy to be here talking about Frances Perkins and really honored to be here, especially accepting an award in her name from the Frances Perkins Center. So thank you very much. Let me talk a little bit about Frances Perkins and what accounts for her extraordinary success. She produced what I think it's fair to say no other cabinet member of her time did. So everybody there was generously involved in the New Deal. But Frances Perkins was involved not only in the New Deal, but in creating and shepherding programs that have lasted down to our own day. So I think that's something that we should all be acknowledging, and we should wonder how it happened that this young woman who grew up in Maine and Massachusetts and went to Mount Holyoke College, how did it happen that she became perhaps you might say an icon of American feminism now, but also one of the names who we ought to be able to remember and cite whenever we talk about things like Social Security or unemployment insurance, or even health insurance, which she tried very hard to get included in the Social Security bill. So when I think about this, I think there are perhaps three areas that we should focus on, which together made Frances not unique by any means, because she was one of a generation of women who all of them felt called to create change in a society which they found to be very unjust. But she was of a generation of women who managed to sort of jump feet first right into the cauldron. And for that extraordinary courage, we have to explore, how is it that she got there? Three things I think we should look at. First, her background. Her parents were Congregationalists, that is, members of a church which was itself committed to a kind of community orientation. Second, her grandmother, who lived in Maine and occupied this beautiful house where this celebration is taking place. And third, her own sense of, you might call it persistence or drive or integrity or courage or stubbornness. You can put all those words together and look at that personality to identify how it tracks her or helps her through a lifetime of struggle and commitment. So for just a minute, let me explore each of those. I think about her family background. Her father was a small businessman who became a relatively larger businessman, was a successful entrepreneur, and who managed to not only send Fanny to Holyoke, but also to educate her through her life, an unusual thing for girls in that age. And there her mother supported her, did enormous support for mothers who tended to channel daughters in that period. After all, this is the 1880s, 1890s. She graduates from Holyoke in 1902. In that period, many women of the sort of middling or upper middling classes would have been trained to become household, to run a good household, to entertain well, to be social partners for men who were on the make. Not Frances, then called Fanny, not Fanny. She was destined, and her mother hoped that she would somehow participate in the wider world. But the sense that Congregationalists had of a kind of duty to the world was what inspired Fanny to move forward. So that's the first thing. The second piece of that was the grandmother, who helped Fanny to understand not only her place in the world, but who also gave her the kinds of coping skills and mechanisms. Fanny retreated to Maine quite frequently, even as a member of the cabinet. When she was tired and she was exhausted, she would return to this beautiful house, sometimes earlier on with the husband and with her daughter. And she would spend several days, sometimes as much as a week, in bed, where she would isolate herself and recover her strength and regroup And then she would emerge ready to go on with the next fight or the next struggle, whatever that was. So Maine was for her a kind of refuge, which she desperately needed and used to the best of her capacity. And then in this sort of sense of personality, was it in Maine where she developed it? Was it childhood? I don't know. Whatever it was, Fanny grew up as a sort of self-willed and a stubborn child. She was known when she was in college as a stubborn, very persuasive person, articulate, persuasive, but hard to change her mind. It was her job, her task, she saw, to convert others to her opinions. So she made an enormous success of her 4 years at Holyoke and became in the end class president at Holyoke, where she exercised the kinds of leadership skills that would serve her well in the years to come. Fanny was known there for her integrity, for her persistence, for her capacity to, you might say, wait for a good time to get what she wanted, for her capacity to listen to others and then to try to persuade them to do as she wished. When she graduated from Holyoke, and here I come to the second sort of element that I think enabled her to be the kind of courageous person that she became. She slowly, but you might say gently, attached herself to a group of women, some of whom were Holyoke graduates, but others of whom you might roughly classify as reformers in the period. In other words, early 1900s was a period in American history which was roiled by, we sometimes call it the progressive period, by efforts of reformers to create a more just society in various kinds of ways. They were reformers who were concerned with corrupt conditions in municipalities, who were concerned with poor working conditions, especially for women and children in factories, who were concerned that the education of girls lagged behind the education of men and who needed and wanted to change those things. So Fanny, or Frances, she then slowly began to use the name Frances and ultimately changed her name from Fanny, which was what she'd been christened, to Frances. Frances gravitated towards these reformers. She taught for a few years at various schools. She worked in and around the social settlement movement, where people like Jane Addams and Florence Kelley in Chicago influenced her. She attached herself to the National Consumers League, or I shouldn't say she attached herself, she was employed by the National Consumers League in the first decade of the 20th century. She became part of, a peripheral part, but still part of the settlement movement. By 1910, 1912, she was involved in the minimum wage movement for women workers. And in all of these activities, she engaged with, planned and plotted with, and drew strength from a coalition of women reformers, some of them well-educated like herself, others of them trade union leaders like Rose Schneiderman, And she learned from this coalition what strength she could draw that would enable her to use a kind of political skill that she exercised later. This group of women, and I should say this now because although she was, you might say, peripheral to it for most of the time, but they were her closest friends. And when she needed help and support or guidance, intellectual or otherwise, she took her cues from one or another member of this group. I'm thinking here of the Abbott sisters, Grace and Edith, one of whom ran the Children's Bureau, another of whom ran the Chicago School of Social Work, of people like Mary Anderson, who was herself, had started as a Women's Trade Union League member, started as a trade union organizer, and then became the head of the Women's Bureau. It was an enormously important touchstone for her, and one that I think we should not underestimate, especially as we think about how we organize our politics today. The idea that one needed a community of supporters, of like-minded people. And then third, I'd say, she managed in this period to acquire a political education, which was unusual for women. So she, early on, did not retreat from accepting hard jobs, some of them with political mandates. So she became an inspector of the Factory Commission, a drafter of an Industrial Commission report. By the 1920s, she was involved with the Democratic Party in New York State. She had come to know Al Smith, who would later go on to become governor. She accepted appointments first on the New York State Industrial Commission and the Industrial Board, and then as Industrial Commissioner of New York. So she had, in this period of the 1920s, So in this period of the 1920s, she learned to work with the political establishment. She learned to think politically. She learned to work with trade unions and trade union leaders who were often quite suspicious of her because, after all, she hadn't come from the factory floor. She learned to not only express empathy, but to explore how her empathy might be used to change the conditions of working people. And it is this relationship to working people that she carried with her into the Labor Department when she became Secretary of Labor. So I'd say those are the three elements which, she drew on in those 16 years and which enabled her to fight for programs which then seemed quite surprising, quite unexpected, quite impossible to perform. So who had ever imagined that there might be a Social Security program, an economic security program, which would provide unemployment insurance on the national level? She had imagined these things on a state level, and she'd worked on unemployment insurance at the state level, not successfully, but she had tried. She'd worked on minimum wages for women. She had even explored health insurance in the 1914, 15, 16 years when New York State was considering a health insurance program. But by 1932, 1933, when she moved into to FDR's cabinet, she was really ready to exercise not only the political and personal skills she had honed, but the understandings that she had gained from having, for the first 20 years of her graduate career, if you like, become a woman who could identify with the struggles of ordinary people. There's one other thing that I should say about that, and it perhaps underlines all of this, which is that Fanny, as Fanny, and then Frances, when she became Frances, was always committed to a kind of democratic outlook on life. She understood America to be a democratic country which could only gain by the representation of all of its citizens. So she desperately wanted new immigrants, the children of immigrants, African Americans who were in the 19 teens moving from south to north to Detroit to other places. She wanted them to be represented in government, and she wanted them to feel that government somehow represented them. And this sort of commitment to a representative democracy is one of the things that inspired her to make sure that ordinary people would have the capacity to vote, to speak their minds, to be heard, to participate in government in various kinds of ways. And I think this also gave her the conviction that it was the job of government to represent ordinary people, that it was the job of governments to safeguard the welfare or to serve the general welfare, as our Constitution says. This sort of underlying commitment, and it was a real commitment. It was, you might not want to call it an ideology, which is what some people might call it today, but this commitment to a government that would represent, would care for its people, was part of what pushed her into trying to change or juggle the chains of power in the government so that government could actually represent ordinary people.
Thank you so much for that wonderful and detailed journey into the past. I hope you don't mind if we ask you a few questions. To begin with, I'd love to know how you began your career as a professional historian.
If you were to ask me what pushed me into women's history, I'd have to say the women's movement. I think that the questions that were raised by the women's movement and the skills that I and other historians had to be able to answer those questions, why had women been so disadvantaged? Why were we always at the bottom of the heap? They were historical questions. And so there was a small generation of women my age and my cohort of graduates who thought they were going to go in another direction and who ended up becoming the women who are now the key historians of women. I think labor historians didn't lose sight of her quite as much as other historians, but they gave her a relatively narrow scope. But it's in the late 1960s and early 1970s when women begin to enter the historical profession in large numbers that her role as a cabinet member would and should have been noticed. It wasn't noticed as much as the roles of other people. And I think the reason for this was because Frances Perkins, like the community of women with whom she associated, really believed strongly in the family, in the traditional family. And as part of that, believed that male breadwinners, I'll put it that way, were essential to the creation and persistence of a traditional family. That though women could and did work of necessity, as she did, they were not meant to. They were meant to be supported at least during the years when they were at home with children by the male breadwinner. Well, in the 1970s, when we, and I count myself among this generation, became historians and turned to women's history, the history of women, we were really interested in individual achievement. We were interested in ambition. We were interested in enterprise among women. We wanted to know about women who had made it. We were rejecting, as the society was then beginning to reject, but we were then rejecting male breadwinner ideology. Now we understand she had been successful largely because she had accepted the larger gender roles and assumed that all of both men and women could be helped, could be stronger if their social roles, collective social roles, were supported by the government. Frances, of course, she understood that if she were going to boss people around, if she were going to run a department, if she were going to lead a commission, she would have to do it not as a woman, but as a person who was capable of doing this. And so she quickly learned that while men did not respect women and could not take orders from them, men did respect their mothers. And so she learned how to act like a mother. You know, she wouldn't give orders, she would ask for people to do what she wanted them to do. And it was a successful tactic for her. You know, it enabled her to become both a successful cabinet member, but also a successful director of the mostly males under her purview. I think my responsibility to the world is probably reflects what Frances Perkins would have said. You know, she thought her responsibility to the world was to create the conditions in which ordinary people could both represent themselves and be represented by the government. She wanted a government which was socially responsible, responsible to its people. She wanted a government where social responsibility would underline and strengthen democratic participation. And I think my responsibility as a historian would echo some of that, would be to illuminate a past where people like Frances have struggled to make that happen, to enable that to happen. And I think it's our responsibility to demonstrate that, you know, in a democratic society, the role of government is to encourage participation, is to hear the voices, to listen to the voices of ordinary people, and to respond and react to them. So God bless Frances Perkins. You know, she said it all, and she did say it in just about those words.
From all of us, thank you so much, Dr. Kessler-Harris, for your insight and your platform. You know, the board is always deeply touched by the generosity of our friends who support the center, from the most modest to the incredible commitment of major gifts. We've often wondered about the wide variety of motivations that leads to these gifts, so we asked. We would like to share with you the observation of some of those donors.
My husband and I were relatively recent relocatees to Maine in 2015, and we were coming out of a restaurant in Daramuscata and saw the sign for the Frances Perkins Center across the street. And I wondered to myself, Frances Perkins is a fellow Mount Holyoke alumna, and what is she doing having a center here named for her? And so we went into the exhibit and spent some time reviewing all of the panels in this small exhibit space, and we're just astounded at the breadth of accomplishments of Frances Perkins during her lifetime. And then we were surprised and dismayed that neither of us fully appreciated just how significant she was in American social and economic history. And it was just a shock, really. And so we left that day with 4 books about her life and her work, and we devoured them all.
I grew up in a family that is very socially conscious, and a lot of it moves back to my grandparents, my father's parents, and my grandmother in particular, who was a young immigrant, 12 years old when she arrived in the United States in 1909. And in 1911, she was sitting in her uncle's cafe. There was lots of commotion outside, and he said, "Oh, let's go see what's happening." And they ran a few blocks north, just in time to see the horror of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. And as my grandmother described it to me many years ago, then she said, and on the horizon came Frances Perkins and her concern about workplace safety. And she said everyone in New York was behind her after this horrific disaster.
So I think the homestead is what embodies one of the things that's so special of Frances Perkins. She was a middle-class New Englander. Her family roots go back here in the homestead over 250 years. And so she was shaped by this place. Her values, her principles, her resiliency, those are all characteristics that she took into her career in public service. And those were shaped because her family, going way back, were brick makers or farmers. And so she comes from working class people who fended for themselves, but sometimes needed help. And she recognized after witnessing the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire that there are people who don't come from even what she came from, and that they would need more assistance.
I'm not a real politically active person, but being able to make small contributions to this organization that is dedicated to helping people understand Frances Perkins and her worldview and understanding of public service, I think is important work in the context of a functional democracy.
This was her happy place. She just loved being here. It was so different than the rest of the year in Worcester, which even then was a city, and she could get here and had 100 acres to run around barefooted, and she would go boating on the river practically on a daily basis, and there were all the animals. And then there was this wonderful grandmother who just had a feeling about this grandchild that she was going to be something. So one of the things she did is almost as soon as Frances arrived, she would make her lie on her back on the biggest table in the house, probably bigger than this, And then Grandma would go get a bunch of books to pile on Frances's chest so that she would have a good elocution lesson about how to project her voice, because there were no microphones, and there wouldn't be for a great many years.
I don't know about everyone, but I think when you can physically visit a place that that holds significance, whether for a particular figure, historical figure, or a particular event, that it's a way to have that history be palpable, a way to have it be visceral, rather than the abstract words on a page. It somehow brings it to life in for me anyway, in a way that's very deep and rewarding. So I think that's just a terrific aspect of this effort to preserve the homestead and make it a place where people can not only learn about the past but think about the problems of the present and what the solutions might be for the future.
And lest you think we're all of a certain generation, we take seriously our mission to continue awareness of Frances Perkins' efforts and motivation to subsequent generations. This effort takes the shape of education, outreach, and internships, all based on New England values. Here are a few examples of our future.
I just love this house very much. I love architecture and all the little things in the house. There's so many different things you can ask about, and everything has a story. And I feel like it's really interesting to learn the environment that Frances Perkins was in and how she lived her life and how life was just in general during her time.
I first was introduced to Frances Perkins when I did a History Day project about her in high school. And then I just through that process was able to meet Chris Bryceth, and at the end of the summer I was able to visit the house in Newcastle and meet Tomlin, and of course from there I went on to be a student at Mount Holyoke, and I had always kind of thought I would want to intern there just because of the interest that I already had in Frances Perkins. And I think that with that, and especially with, people my age have been through 2 recessions now in our lifetime, there's a global pandemic, everything is a lot more pressing than I think it was for past generations, and I'm hoping that our generation can take that and make policy and do laws and just go forward in a way that takes all of that into account.
I think the next generation has terrific challenges, but they also have opportunity. It's important to me because my daughter is young, she's 22, and so I look at her and the young people near her age. Some of them are quite disheartened, but I think that it's also a time where they can make a huge difference. And so I'm counting on them, encouraging them that this can be their moment for the environment, for our social fabric, for many important causes.
Well, I think that as much as individual action and belief is good, I think that policy is really the way to make lasting change. I don't think that before the New Deal, everyone was totally cool with child labor, but I think that the New Deal was really the, having the power to say this, something is legal versus something is immoral is really powerful. And being able to say child labor is not only immoral, but it is now illegal. You cannot do it. That holds a lot more weight to most people in regards to most issues in the world.
Because you can dig down, you can get a deep hole, scoop it out, and then you can put a post in, or maybe, what else would we need a deep hole for?
And not to sound corny or anything, I feel that just looking in a textbook or online isn't enough. It's very basic, very boring. It's much better to be in person with someone who has great knowledge and can teach you, and better to have an atmosphere to look around and look at the tools or look at the history that's just around here in this area to help. It would definitely help them learn a lot more.
Thank you all for gathering in your homes tonight to celebrate Frances Perkins and the mission of the center. The copper wires and fiber optics necessary to connect us this evening are poor substitutes for the much stronger heartstrings that bind us to each other.
We're so grateful that you've joined us today. Thank you for your contributions to our work and to making the homestead safe and accessible for all who wish to come here to be inspired by the life and work of Frances Perkins, a great American. So remember to follow our newsletters, our website, and social media posts for updates on the restoration of this beautiful property and for the latest news and instructions on how to participate in our programs as they reopen. Our courses, our publications, our tours, our public policy forums, and our internships.
We will close out this ungarden garden party with a toast and some cake, and the observations of Susan Bateson and Kirsten Downey, the author that has been referenced throughout this evening's presentation as the catalyst that introduced Frances Perkins to so many people.
Today is a joyous day. It's extraordinary that this group of dynamic people have come together and come up with a way to preserve this wonderful homestead. Frances Perkins would be the first one to tell you, and in fact often said this, that progressives stand on the shoulders of the progressives who came before them. So Frances Perkins learned a lot from Jane Addams at Hull House in Chicago. And of course, the whole concept of Hull House is that progressive-minded people who want to do good things should have a place to come together and to discuss their good ideas and figure out how best to put them into action. I think this is the goal with the Frances Perkins Center. And hopefully we'll be creating a think tank at the Frances Perkins Center that will be the next generation of thinking about what do we do to ensure the best possible life for everyone in America.
We help bring that to a broader audience. We bring her life, we bring her work. We celebrate the anniversary of Social Security, which was perhaps her biggest accomplishment. But beyond that, our role is to convene today's public policy leaders and foster bipartisan, constructive dialogue about the issues facing the nation today. And so by convening professionals and fostering an environment where they can have a dialogue and share ideas and put forth ideas to a public audience, that for us is continuing Frances' work.
One of the things that we most have to celebrate right now about Frances Perkins' life is how much she's helping us today. 65 million people on Social Security and 30 million people on unemployment insurance, a record. And that is Frances Perkins' legacy. And that is the legacy of the Frances Perkins Center.
Thank you so much, everyone. See you next year, if not before. Now, you know, Frances Perkins' favorite cocktail was bourbon and branch water, and part of our ending this evening is to raise a glass to all of you who support us throughout the year. Cheers to Frances Perkins.
And to you all.
I think we need some cake.
Laura, it's time for cake. Here's Laura Cheney, our esteemed development director, with a Social Security cake that is always traditional at garden parties and at this virtual garden party as well. Cheers.
Oh, how wonderful. Oh, wonderful. My favorite portrait of her sitting at the desk. Thank you very much. This is indeed a great honor. Can I read it?
Yes, please.
It says, Frances Perkins, U.S. Secretary of Labor, 1933 to 45, Intelligence and Courage Award. I promise to use what brains I have to meet problems with intelligence and courage. I promise that I will be candid about what I know. I promise to all of you who have the right to know the whole truth as far as I can speak it. And she actually kept that promise. That's quite wonderful. Thank you very much. This is really wonderful.